They tried to burn his books, exile his followers, and erase his name from history forever. Because what he discovered about God, death, and the universe was so dangerous that entire empires trembled at the thought of ordinary people knowing it. Welcome back. If this is your first time here, this channel is dedicated to the most forbidden and paradigm-shattering philosophies ever recorded. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a revelation. There is a name that has been systematically removed from mainstream education, deliberately buried beneath centuries of institutional silence, and violently suppressed by the most powerful organizations in human history. That name is Giordano Bruno. And if you have never heard of him, that is not an accident. That is the point. Because Giordano Bruno did not simply disagree with the religious and political establishments of his time. He did not merely challenge a few outdated ideas or propose minor corrections to existing theories. What Bruno did was far more radical, far more dangerous, and far more liberating than anything that had been spoken aloud in centuries. He looked directly into the face of the most powerful institution on earth and told them that everything they had built their authority upon was a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of God, the universe, and the human soul. He told them that the universe was infinite, that there was no single center of creation, that the stars in the night sky were not decorations painted on a divine ceiling, but were themselves suns, each one burning with the same fire as our own, each one potentially surrounded by worlds teeming with life and consciousness. He told them that God was not a distant monarch sitting on a throne beyond the clouds, dispensing judgment and collecting obedience. God, according to Bruno, was the infinite itself. God was the universe. God was the very substance of existence, present in every atom, every flame, every thought, and every soul. And perhaps most dangerously of all, he told them that the human soul was immortal not because a church had granted it salvation, but because the soul was a fragment of the infinite divine mind, a spark of the very consciousness that breathed the cosmos into being. These were not the ravings of a madman. These were the conclusions of one of the most brilliant, courageous, and relentlessly curious minds that has ever existed on this planet. And for daring to speak these truths aloud, Giordano Bruno was imprisoned for 8 years, subjected to repeated interrogation and psychological torture, offered his freedom repeatedly in exchange for a single act of surrender, and when he refused every single time, he was stripped naked. His tongue was pinned to silence him, so he could not speak even his final words, and he was burned alive in the Campo de Fori in Rome on February 17th in the year 1600. The authorities believed that by burning his body, they could burn his ideas. They were wrong. Because here we are, more than 400 years later, and the questions Bruno asked are more alive, more urgent, and more revolutionary than ever before. This is not simply a story about one man's death. This is a story about what he discovered. And what he discovered has the power to change everything you think you know about who you are, why you are here, and what happens when the body you are currently wearing finally gives out. To truly understand why Bruno's ideas were so explosive, you have to understand the world that produced him. Giordano Bruno was born in Nola, in the Kingdom of Naples, in the year 1548. He entered a world that was, in almost every conceivable way, organized around a single, total, all-encompassing idea. That idea was that the Earth was the center of the universe. Not just the physical center, but the spiritual center, the moral center, the center of God's attention and God's concern. According to the dominant cosmology of the time, which had been inherited from the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle and sanctified by centuries of church doctrine, the universe was a finite and perfectly ordered system. The Earth sat motionless at the very heart of creation. Around it rotated a series of crystalline spheres, each one carrying a celestial body. The moon on the innermost sphere, then Mercury, then Venus, then the Sun, then Mars and Jupiter, then Saturn, and finally, on the outermost sphere, the fixed stars, all of them embedded in a single rotating shell like jewels set into a dome. Beyond that outermost sphere was the Empyrean, the dwelling place of God and the angels, a realm of pure light and divine perfection that existed outside of time and space. This model was not merely a scientific theory. It was a theological statement. It said that humanity occupied a special, privileged, divinely appointed position at the very center of all that existed. It said that the universe was finite, closed, and perfectly comprehensible. It said that God was separate from creation, a divine architect who had built the machine and now stood outside it, watching and judging from beyond the final sphere. And it said that the Church, as the intermediary between humanity and that distant God, held absolute authority over every question of meaning, purpose, morality, and salvation. To question the cosmology was to question the theology. To question the theology was to question the authority. And to question the authority was to invite the full and devastating weight of institutional power to descend upon you without mercy. Bruno grew up breathing this air. He entered the Dominican order as a young man, and for years he studied the established doctrines with genuine devotion. But Bruno had a mind that could not be contained. He read voraciously and without restriction, consuming not only the approved texts but the forbidden ones as well. He encountered the work of Nicolaus Copernicus, the Polish astronomer who had proposed, cautiously and almost apologetically, that the Earth actually moved around the Sun rather than the other way around. For most people, the Copernican system was a mathematical convenience, a useful tool for calculating the positions of planets that happened to produce slightly more accurate results than the old Earth-centered model. For Bruno, it was a doorway, a crack in the wall of the established universe through which an entirely different kind of light was streaming. And Bruno walked through that door without hesitation and without looking back. What Bruno found on the other side of that door was a vision of the cosmos so vast, so radical, and so theologically subversive that it would not be fully accepted by mainstream science until centuries after his death. Bruno looked at the Copernican model and asked a question that no one else had dared to ask. If the Earth is not the center of the solar system, why should the solar system be the center of the universe? And if the solar system is not the center, then where exactly is the center? And if there is no center, then what are the boundaries? And if there are no the boundaries, then what does that mean about the nature of God? His answer was breathtaking in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. There are no boundaries. The universe is infinite. The stars you see at night are not holes in a celestial dome, and they are not decorations placed there for humanity's aesthetic pleasure. Each star is a sun, a burning, blazing furnace of energy and light, as massive and as powerful as our own sun, separated from us not by the thickness of a crystal sphere, but by distances so enormous that the human mind can barely begin to comprehend them. And around those distant suns, Bruno proposed, there are other worlds, other planets circling other stars, in an infinite universe that extends in every direction without end and without boundary. This was not a minor revision of existing cosmology. This was the complete demolition of the entire conceptual framework upon which Western civilization had been built. If the universe is infinite, then there is no center. If there is no center, then the Earth is not the center. If the Earth is not the center, then humanity is not the special, privileged, divinely appointed focal point of all creation. If humanity is not the focal point, then the entire theological architecture that had been built upon that assumption collapses. No special creation. No cosmic monarchy with Earth as the throne room. No distant God watching from beyond the final sphere. Bruno understood this completely, and rather than finding it terrifying, he found it magnificent, because in place of the small, closed, hierarchical universe of the Church, Bruno proposed something infinitely more beautiful and infinitely more profound. He proposed a universe that was not the residence of God, but was itself the body of God. An infinite living, breathing, self-aware cosmos in which the divine was not separate from creation, but was identical to it, present in every particle, every ray of light, every conscious being, every star burning in the endless night. This brings us to what is perhaps the most revolutionary and most personally dangerous aspect of Bruno's philosophy, his theology. because Bruno was not simply an astronomer or a cosmologist. He was a philosopher and a mystic, and his understanding of the infinite universe led him directly to an understanding of the divine that was utterly incompatible with the official teachings of the Church. The God of institutional Christianity in Bruno's time was, in essence, a very powerful king. He existed outside of and separate from the creation he had made. He had specific preferences, issued specific commandments, rewarded specific behaviors, and punished others. He had a hierarchy of intermediaries through which his will was communicated to humanity, and that hierarchy culminated, on earth, in the institution of the Church. Bruno looked at this conception of God and found it not merely intellectually unsatisfying, but philosophically incorrect. How, he asked, could an infinite and perfect being be separate from anything? If God is truly infinite, then there can be nothing outside of God. There can be no space, no dimension, no atom, no thought, no moment in time that exists beyond the boundaries of the divine. To say that God is infinite and yet separate from creation is a contradiction. It is to define a boundary around the infinite, which is to make it finite. Therefore, Bruno concluded, God and the universe are not two separate things. They are one and the same thing perceived from two different perspectives. The universe, in all its staggering vastness, in all its complexity and beauty and violence and creativity, is the self-expression of an infinite divine consciousness. It is not a machine built by a distant craftsman. It is a living thought being thought by a living mind. And that living mind is God. Bruno drew heavily from a tradition of thought that had existed on the margins of Western philosophy for centuries, a tradition rooted in the ancient Egyptian and Greek mystery schools, carried forward through the writings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, refined by the Neoplatonist philosophers of late antiquity, and preserved in fragments and whispers through the medieval period. This tradition taught that the divine is not a person but a principle, not a being among other beings, but the very ground of being itself, not a creator separate from creation but the creative force that is identical with all that it creates. In the language of this tradition, everything that exists is a manifestation of the One, and the One is present in everything that exists. Bruno called this the Infinite One. He described it as the Absolute, the all-encompassing unity from which all multiplicity emerges, and to which all multiplicity eternally returns. And he taught that this Infinite One was not only the substance of the external universe, but was also the deepest truth of every human soul. Perhaps the most personally resonant and practically transformative dimension of Bruno's philosophy concerns the nature of the human soul and what happens to it after the death of the physical body. In the official teaching of the Church, the soul was a specific, individual, divinely created entity that was given to each human being at birth, lived one earthly life, was then judged by God on the basis of that life, and was sent either to eternal reward in heaven or eternal punishment in a realm of suffering. The soul was, in essence, a moral unit created for the purpose of being tested and judged. Bruno's understanding of the soul was radically different. If God is the infinite and the soul is a fragment of the infinite divine consciousness, then the soul is, at its deepest level, not a created thing at all. It is not something given to a human being by a distant God. It is a localized expression of the infinite itself, a point at which the universal consciousness becomes temporarily individualized in order to have a particular experience. This means several things of enormous importance. First, the soul is not mortal. It cannot die, because it is not separate from the infinite, and the infinite by definition cannot be destroyed or diminished. The death of the physical body is the dissolution of a temporary vehicle, not the destruction of the consciousness that was using it. Second, the soul is not bound to a single life. If the soul is an expression of an infinite consciousness exploring the infinite possibilities of existence, then one human lifetime is not a final examination but one episode in an endless adventure of self-exploration. Bruno believed in a form of metempsychosis, the transmigration of souls through multiple bodies and multiple forms of existence, as the infinite consciousness continuously seeks new modes of experience and new forms of self-knowledge. Third, and most dangerously from the perspective of institutional authority. The soul does not require an external mediator to connect it to the divine. If the soul is itself a fragment of the divine consciousness, then the divine is not somewhere outside the soul waiting to be petitioned through the correct ritual performed by the correct official. The divine is the innermost nature of the soul itself. The path to God does not run through any institution, any hierarchy, any official, or any prescribed set of behaviors. It runs inward, into the depths of one's own consciousness, toward the infinite that was never separate from you in the first place. This was the teaching that the Church found most intolerable of all. Not the astronomy, not the infinite universe, not even the plurality of worlds. The truly unforgivable idea was the one that made the Church itself unnecessary. The idea that every human being already carries within them the seed of the infinite divine, and that the entire elaborate structure of institutional religion, with its sacraments and its indulgences and its hierarchies and its threats of eternal damnation, was not the bridge between humanity and God, but the barrier. Bruno's vision of an infinite universe populated by countless worlds was not merely an astronomical hypothesis. It was a philosophical and spiritual declaration of the most radical kind. Consider what it means if the stars are suns, and those suns have planets, and those planets harbor life and consciousness. It means that the human story, however rich and significant it may be to us, is not the whole story. It is one story among an infinite number of stories being lived simultaneously across an infinite number of worlds. There is no single chosen people, no single chosen planet, no single chosen religion that holds the exclusive franchise on divine truth. Every conscious being in this infinite universe, on every world circling every star, is equally an expression of the same infinite divine consciousness. Every form of life, every mode of awareness, every way of experiencing existence is equally valid, equally sacred, equally an aspect of the infinite exploring itself. This is what Bruno called the democracy of being. The infinite is not more present in a cathedral than in a meadow. It is not more fully expressed in a priest than in a farmer. It is not more accessible to the educated than to the illiterate, more available to the European than to the inhabitant of a distant world orbiting a distant star. The divine pervades everything with absolute equality and absolute impartiality, because the divine is everything and everything is the divine. From this perspective, the entire apparatus of religious exclusivity collapses. The claim that any particular tradition holds the unique and exclusive truth about God becomes not just intellectually unjustifiable but cosmically absurd. In an infinite universe teeming with consciousness, the idea that one small group on one small planet orbiting one ordinary star among hundreds of billions of stars in one galaxy among hundreds of billions of galaxies has been specially selected as the sole recipient of divine truth is a proposition that can only be maintained by refusing to look at the sky. Bruno looked at the sky, and what he saw there was not the confirmation of human specialness, but the liberation of the human soul from the prison, cosmic smallness. You are not a tiny, sinful creature huddled at the center of a small, closed universe, trembling before a judgmental God who may or may not decide to save you. You are a manifestation of the infinite itself, temporarily inhabiting a physical form on one of countless worlds in an endless cosmos, participating in an adventure of consciousness so vast and so beautiful that no human language has yet been invented that can fully describe it. After leaving the Dominican order under the pressure of his own relentlessly unconventional thinking, Bruno spent years wandering across Europe, teaching, debating, writing, and publishing. He lectured in Geneva, Paris, London, Oxford, Wittenberg, Prague, Frankfurt, and Zurich. He encountered some of the greatest minds of his era. He published dozens of works in Latin and in Italian, laying out his cosmological and philosophical system with extraordinary richness and detail. He was celebrated in some places, attacked in others, and everywhere he went he left behind a trail of minds that had been permanently expanded and establishments that had been permanently unsettled. In 1591, Bruno made the decision that would seal his fate. He accepted an invitation to return to Italy, to Venice. where a wealthy nobleman named Giovanni Mocenigo had offered him patronage and accommodation in exchange for lessons in the art of memory, one of Bruno's many areas of expertise. What Bruno may not have fully appreciated was how dramatically the political and religious atmosphere in Italy had deteriorated since his departure. The Counter-Reformation was in full force. The Roman Inquisition was at the height of its power and vigilance, and Giovanni Mocenigo, for reasons that remain somewhat obscure, decided to betray his guest. In May of 1592, Mocenigo wrote a letter to the Venetian Inquisition denouncing Bruno for heresy. Bruno was arrested, imprisoned, and began the long and agonizing process of inquisitorial examination. The Venetian Inquisition interrogated him for months. Bruno, demonstrating a combination of tactical intelligence and philosophical integrity, acknowledged some of his more theologically unconventional positions, while attempting to frame them in ways that might be acceptable to the inquisitors. He was willing to discuss, to clarify, to contextualize. What he was not willing to do was simply recant and declare that everything he had spent his life thinking and writing and teaching was wrong. In 1600, the Roman Inquisition demanded his transfer to Rome. In Rome, the process continued for another 7 years. 7 years of imprisonment, 7 years of interrogation, 7 years of being offered freedom in exchange for submission. And through all of it, Bruno refused. We do not have a full record of exactly what charges were brought against him in their final form, because those records were deliberately destroyed, but we know the result. On February 8th in the year 1600, Bruno was brought before the inquisitors, and the sentence was read. He was declared an unrepentant heretic and condemned to death. According to the account that has survived, when the sentence was read, Bruno looked at his judges and said, "Perhaps you who pronounce my sentence are in greater fear than I who receive it." 8 days later, he was burned alive in the Campo de' Fiori in the center of Rome, in front of a crowd gathered to watch the spectacle of institutional power destroying the body of a man whose ideas it could not destroy. Bruno walked to his death with a serenity that reportedly unnerved his executioners. And if you understand what he believed about the nature of consciousness and the soul, that serenity makes perfect sense. Bruno did not believe that death was the end of anything. He believed, based on the philosophical system he had spent his life developing, that the consciousness that animated his body was a fragment of the infinite divine consciousness, and therefore could no more be destroyed by burning his body than the ocean could be destroyed by removing a cup of water from it. The water in the cup might be poured out, the cup might be smashed, but the water itself, the essential substance, returns to the infinite ocean from which it was never truly separate. Bruno understood death not as termination but as transformation. The particular temporary configuration of matter and energy that constituted his physical body would dissolve, but the consciousness that had inhabited that body, the awareness that had looked out through those eyes and thought those thoughts and asked those questions and refused those demands, that consciousness would continue. Not in some separate supernatural realm disconnected from the universe, but within the infinite itself, which it had always been a part of, and had never truly left. This understanding of death is not unique to Bruno. It appears in various forms, across many of the world's deepest philosophical and spiritual traditions. The ancient Egyptian understanding of the soul as a multi-layered phenomenon of which physical death was only the dissolution of the outermost layer. The Orphic and Neoplatonist teaching of the soul as a divine spark temporarily imprisoned in matter, destined to ascend through multiple incarnations toward its source in the infinite one. The Hermetic tradition's insistence that the soul that knows itself knows God, because the soul and God are ultimately identical. The Gnostic understanding that the deepest self is not the ego that fears death, but the pure awareness that was never born and therefore can never die. What Bruno contributed to this ancient stream of understanding was a cosmological framework that made it intellectually coherent in the context of the emerging scientific worldview. He took the mystical insight that consciousness is infinite and grounded it in the astronomical observation that the universe is infinite. He took the spiritual teaching that the soul is divine and connected it to the philosophical argument that if God is infinite, then nothing can be outside of God, including the human soul. He created a synthesis of science, philosophy, and mysticism that pointed toward a single, electrifying conclusion. You are not a temporary biological accident living a single brief life in a small, closed, finite universe. You are an expression of the infinite itself, exploring existence in an infinite cosmos, through a succession of forms and lives and worlds, eternally and indestructibly alive. The authorities of 1600 believed that burning Bruno's body would silence his ideas. History has delivered its verdict on that belief, and that verdict is unambiguous. Bruno's ideas did not die in the Campo de Fiori. They went underground for a time, as ideas do when the cost of holding them becomes too high. But they continued to circulate, continued to influence, continued to grow. Within a decade of Bruno's death, Galileo Galilei was using the telescope to accumulate observational evidence that the Earth did indeed move around the Sun, just as Copernicus had proposed and Bruno had enthusiastically endorsed and extended. By the middle of the 17th century, the infinite universe that Bruno had described philosophically was beginning to be confirmed observationally. By the 18th century, the Enlightenment thinkers who were laying the intellectual foundations of the modern world were drawing directly on the tradition of free philosophical inquiry that Bruno had helped to establish at the cost of his life. By the 19th century, philosophers and scientists were beginning to grapple seriously with the implications of an infinite universe for our understanding of consciousness, identity, and the nature of mind. And in the 20th and 21st centuries, the questions Bruno raised have returned with new urgency and new depth. Quantum physics has revealed a universe in which the classical boundaries between observer and observed, between subject and object, between the individual and the cosmos, are far less clear and far less absolute than they appeared to be. Consciousness studies have produced a growing body of philosophical and scientific work suggesting that awareness may be a fundamental feature of reality rather than a byproduct of biological processes. Near-death experience research, whatever one thinks of its ultimate implications, has generated a substantial and persistent body of testimony suggesting that consciousness continues to function in ways that current biological models cannot fully account for. The multiverse hypotheses emerging from the most advanced theoretical physics describe a cosmos of almost unimaginable vastness and complexity, teeming with worlds and possibilities in ways that would have been immediately recognizable to Bruno as a confirmation of his intuition. We are living in a moment when the questions Bruno died asking are being asked again, more rigorously, more openly, and more urgently than at any time since his death. And the answers that are beginning to emerge are pointing in the same direction that Bruno pointed 4 centuries ago, toward a universe that is alive with consciousness, toward a God that is not separate from creation but is identical with it, toward a human soul that is not a temporary biological passenger but an expression of the infinite itself, toward a death that is not an ending but a transformation. The most dangerous philosopher in history was dangerous not because his ideas were destructive. He was dangerous because his ideas were liberating. And liberation is always dangerous to those whose power depends on keeping people afraid. All of this history, all of this philosophy, all of this cosmic drama culminates in a single, practical, personally urgent question. What does it mean for you, right now, today, living the life you are living? If Bruno was right, if the universe is truly infinite and God is truly identical with that infinite, if your soul is genuinely a fragment of the infinite divine consciousness and not a temporary biological accident, then several things follow that have immediate and profound implications for how you live. The first is that you are not what you have been told you are. From the moment of your birth, you have been surrounded by stories about what you are. Stories from your family, from your culture, from your educational institutions, from your media, from your religious traditions, if you have them. Most of those stories describe you as a finite, temporary, relatively insignificant being living a single brief life in a vast, indifferent universe, subject to forces far greater than yourself, ultimately bound for dissolution and oblivion. Bruno's philosophy proposes an entirely different story. You are a localized expression of the infinite divine consciousness. The same awareness that breathes the cosmos into existence is the awareness looking out through your eyes right now. The same intelligence that maintains the orbits of planets and the fusion reactions of stars is the intelligence that beats your heart and fires the neurons of your brain. You are not a visitor to the universe. You are the universe, locally and temporarily expressing itself in the form of a human being. The second implication is that death is not what you have been told it is. The terror of death that underlies so much of human behavior, the compulsive accumulation of material security, the desperate clinging to youth and health, the frantic search for meaning in the face of apparent meaninglessness. Much of this terror is grounded in a specific story about what death means. That story says that death is the final and absolute end of your particular conscious existence, that the awareness that is reading these words right now will, at some point, simply cease to be. Bruno's philosophy says something radically different. If consciousness is not a product of the brain, but is the fundamental substance of reality, then the death of the brain does not produce the death of consciousness any more than the destruction of a radio produces the death of the radio signal. The signal continues, the awareness continues. The particular temporary form it was using dissolves, but the awareness itself, the infinite consciousness that was animating that form, returns to and continues as the infinite from which it was never truly separate. The third implication is that you have access to a source of wisdom, creativity, and understanding that is far deeper than your conditioned personality. If the deepest layer of your being is the infinite divine consciousness itself, then when you go quiet enough and deep enough within yourself, you are not accessing your own limited personal awareness. You are accessing the awareness that contains and sustains the entire cosmos. Every insight, every creative breakthrough, every moment of genuine understanding that has ever emerged from a human mind is a moment when that mind has temporarily dropped below the surface chatter of conditioned thought and touched the infinite beneath. Bruno spent his life in that contact. That is where his courage came from. That is why he could walk to his death with serenity. Not because he was indifferent to his life, but because he knew at the deepest level of his being that the life he was living was not all that he was.